we traverse across locations. I think the morning session, the speaker was in Nagpur. Then we went to Delhi, then for Bombay, and then Delhi, and then came back to Trivandrum for a hybrid session. And we end the day with a speaker from Cambridge. So we have with us Dr. Reika Bangaokra. She is a postdoctoral research associate at University of Cambridge. Her research focuses on understanding resource use sustainability. She works, her main work is in this project called Tigress, where she assessed agricultural communities' abilities in irrigation management. These are communities that are located in semi-arid regions in India, a particular theme that has been consistent across all the talk today. Most of the speakers have been talking about semi-arid regions in the country. And so with semi-arid regions, the crucial problem at least in some parts of semi-arid regions is groundwater-based irrigation and management of groundwater. And that is crucial for building climate-resilient agriculture. And groundwater depletion is in some of these semi-arid areas already an alarming problem. Rekha uses economic theories and statistical data as the base for analyzing resource use behavior and work towards applying a systems approach to understand sustainability. She has a doctoral degree from another Center for Development Studies at University of Cambridge and a postgraduate degree from Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. I think she again has some connection with CDS. I think for, I don't know how many months, few months, she joined here as a doctoral candidate. And then for certain reasons, she had to go back, but then it's a pleasure to have her back as a doctor, once who has completed her PhD and is doing well on certain projects. So we are very happy to have you here, Rekha, and the floor is yours to take the talk forward. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that generous introduction. Yes, of course, I have very fond memories of Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. I think the few months that I spent in that campus is really when I had time to think through my research topic, and even moving in the direction of water has been an inspiration from Center for Development Studies, and I'm eternally thankful to that. So I think we will start, because this is an online presentation. What I would like to do is I'll try to present my work and then probably take questions at the end of the presentation, because I'm not very sure how we will be able to manage questions while the talk is going on. There is a good chance that I might not see the chats if you put in some questions on the chat. So if we could hold on to any of our questions to the end of the talk, I will be most comfortable doing so. But if there are any pressing questions, please do not hold back. You can stop me and I'm happy to answer it then and there. Okay? All right. So again, really, thank you very much for coming to the session. I know it is really late in India now, and I will try to do justice to your time. Right. I will share my PPTs. Are you able to see it?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's fine. You're able to see the presentation, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you're able to see it? Okay.
Yeah.
I just close this window. So, yes, good evening, everyone. The title for my talk is Collective Action Problems in Groundwater Management. How I have aligned the discussion or my presentation is that first we look at certain cases, like, what are examples of common pool resources, and then we will move on to discussing some of the issues with common pool resources, particularly in the perspective of management of common pool resources. Then I will move on to introducing a very popular framework which is used to look at sustainability of common pool resources. And then we will try to apply that framework into certain specific research questions, research context in general. And as Tiago was mentioning, most of the work that I'm presenting today is coming from the dryland regions of India. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so some of the examples of common pool resources, and the most popular example is the grazing lands. And then we have open access fisheries that should be somewhere in Kerala. So the open access fisheries is another good example for common pool resources. And then you have surface water irrigation canals as a good example of common pool resources. Now we'll move on to defining what a common pool resource is. So to define common pool resources, we basically use two axes, or to say resource characteristics. One of that being subtractive availability of the resource, and the other being non-excludability. When we refer to subtractive availability, it simply means that by me consuming that resource, what is left for consumption to subsequent users are less. In other words, with every addition of a resource user, the quantity or the quality of the resource available for consumption decreases. In terms of non-excludability, as the term refers, it is the difficulty in excluding somebody from accessing the resource. Okay, so what it really then creates is a huge challenge in terms of managing the common pool resource. Okay, this difficult resource is referred to as tragedy of commons, and this term is accredited to an ecologist called Gareth Hardens. And he pitches, or he introduces the concept of tragedy of commons in the background of the Malthusian Theorem. So the Malthusian Theorem, as we know, is a proposition that while human population increases in an exponential progression manner, resources follow a geometric progression. Now, what it inevitably does is to push us into a situation where the availability of resource reduces, per capita availability of resource reduces. Now, with the survival instinct of human beings, what we tend to do is over harvest the resource. That is, we either consume the resource and even hoard the resource, leading into a situation where you either deplete the resource or over harvest the common pool resource. Now, Gareth is an American ecologist, and he says that the way to fix this problem is either to nationalize the resource, that is, the government would take in control of the resource and then use it probably the command and control way, or we open up the markets and allow regulations to have property rights defined around the resource, and then the market could, with its invisible hands, allow an efficient allocation of this resource. Now, nearly 40 years from this work, publication of this work, because Tragedy of Commons was published in 1968, roughly 40 years from then, Elinor Ostrom said that there is an alternative way of managing this commons, and that is through self-organization and collective action. So she proposed a framework for analyzing sustainability of socio-ecological systems, and this is a life's work. Okay, this very popular framework is based on numerous case studies, and Elinor Ostrom, who is a political scientist, again an American political economist, won the Nobel Prize for this piece of her work. Okay, so a thematic representation of the framework is that socio-ecological systems, the sustainability of socio-ecological systems can be defined in terms of interaction between resource systems, resource units, governance systems, and users, and the outcome that is produced because of these interactions. Now, this is a very thematic representation of the SES framework, but in real terms, it is basically a huge, exhaustive list of nearly more than 60 indicators of measuring sustainability of common pool resource systems. Now, I will highlight some of the main indicators. Of course, all the 60 indicators cannot be tracked at any point in time. So as the research context demands, for example, we might be working with one particular common pool resource, for example, water or forest, and there might be very specific indicators that are present in this metrics that will be traced in the study. Okay, but having said that, there are certain indicators which kind of appear in almost all analysis. And I will just highlight those. In terms of resource system, it is the discussions around the boundary of the resource system. In terms of governance systems, it is the property right regime or the collective action rules that the communities are able to come up with. In terms of resource units, it is the growth and replacement rate and also the mobility or the stationarity nature of the resource. For example, forest might be very different from studying water, and what that might be very different from studying air. Okay, and in terms of users, the biggest indicator is the number of users. Okay, and in terms of interaction and outcomes, as you see, it is harvesting levels of diverse users and whether they have a chance to communicate with each other, because that will determine the outcome. And in the same way, in terms of outcomes, you can see this is a very exhaustive set. It looks at social parameters and also looks at ecological parameters like biodiversity and sustainability, as well as it considers the that any socio-ecological system can create to a resource system that is adjacent to it or out of that system. So it is also looking at the intercompatibility between one socio-ecological system as well as something else. Okay, are you still able to see my PowerPoint? I could hear a sound, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Now we are seeing the one with all the 60 factors you were mentioning, resource systems, resource units.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so now let us move to the key resource system that we are talking about here. What you see is the groundwater resource system, right? The groundwater. So groundwater is a common pool resource, and groundwater is a crucial common pool resource. Now, groundwater is the largest primary source of fresh water. India is one of the biggest consumer of groundwater. Nearly 60% of the cultivated land is irrigated using groundwater, and it satisfies more than 85% of drinking water requirements in the country. So the importance of groundwater just cannot be emphasized enough. And for dryland agriculture, this is a resource that is the lifeline. Now, increasingly because of climate risks, variability in the variability in rainfall that the regions receive, and also rising temperatures, desertification that happens, dryland agriculture can only be salvaged. Any form of climate resilience can be built into dryland agriculture only with access to groundwater resources. So most of the dryland agriculture development model, and particularly if you look at the last 20 years, follows this pattern of harvesting the annual seasonal rainfall, the biggest source of water in these regions, using that water to recharge the groundwater tables. Then farmers could access that groundwater through investments, private investments in irrigation well, which then gives them a source of irrigation, either a choice of bringing more land under irrigation or to use that water as protective irrigation. And in that way, either increase their income or at the least secure their farm incomes. But as you can see, unfortunately, nearly 30% of the groundwater reserves are either overexploited or in the critical or semi-critical state in India. And it is further unfortunate to notice that it is in these dryland regions that groundwater levels are further exploited. That's the one that needs to be protected. Okay, but as we know, because groundwater is a common pool resource, the challenge of managing groundwater is going to be a big one. And in the context of India, this is particularly so because there is no separation between land use rights and water use rights. Anybody that owns a piece of land is also entitled to the water that flows beneath the land. And what makes groundwater much more a critical resource to manage is because it is also one of a hidden resource. Like among the common pool resource, this is a resource that is referred to as a hidden resource. People are not able to see the source of the resource, neither are they able to know how the resource is interconnected. Yes, resource users do have a sense that their irrigation wells are interconnected. They certainly do have that sense. But because it is not visible to the eyes, it is very difficult to understand what are the impacts of their resource use action on the resource system as a whole. Okay. So this is also one reason why collective action and common pool resource management, such as surface water irrigation, has been much more successful in comparison to management of irrigation systems that are dependent on groundwater. Now, further, another quality of groundwater is that all the development around groundwater potential that has happened in India has been driven by private investments. Okay, so this leads really leads into a situation where management of such a critical resource is one of the most challenging one as well. Okay, and the theme that I have today across all the research papers that will be presented today is that it is possible to salvage this resource. It is possible to have a sustainable groundwater management if we encourage self-organization and collective action. Of course, it is a very big target to achieve, but this is our hope. And if you look at the most recent regulation, the Groundwater Bill, Model Groundwater Bill, which was passed in 2017, clearly points us to the direction that it is participation, it is self-organization and collective action, which can give us a solution. Another point that I wanted to mention in terms of private investment in groundwater management is that according to the Minor Irrigation Census Report of 2015, there are more than 21 million wells in the country. And I think the most recent update is that there are nearly 27 million wells in the country. So monitoring them, it's almost an impossible task. And that's precisely why we are pushing in the direction of self-organization and collective action to build the capacity of local governance institutions in the management of common pool resources. Now, how do we achieve this? So the argument is that if we demystify the information, demystify the knowledge around groundwater resource system to its users, there is a good chance that we can encourage actions of self-organization, which can finally culminate into creation of norms for resource use, norms for groundwater use. Okay, and I think in the next few slides we will discuss the application of SES framework, and even the pitch that we have made today, which is self-organization and collective action, is completely the Ostrom's argument and completely in the realm of the SES systems and systems analysis. And the following research papers use these three aspects: games as a way to encourage and demystify knowledge around groundwater, demystify knowledge around the resource system, the use of water budget tools, again, sustainable management of groundwater is what it is pointing to. And finally, participatory groundwater management, again, a data science which is generated from the bottom up. How can all the three of this lead to self-organization and collective action? Okay, so the first research paper that we have is playing games to save groundwater. So this is a work done by Ruth et al. And published in 2018. She is a member of, I think, IFPRI. And the main question that they address is, if self-governance can encourage effective and sustainable outcomes, what can be done to stimulate self-governance? Okay, so that self-governance, we are talking about collective action, how to encourage collective action. So the main argument that the authors make is, games can be a very effective tool to generate some kind of learning. Okay, this learning in turn will influence the preferences of resource users. Okay, so it's something as referred to as a mental node, understanding of the resource system. And if I plug it back into the SES system, it is a property U7 under users. Okay, so learning can alter the preferences of resource users towards more sustainable groundwater management. Okay, so here the reference to the game and the design of the game is very important. So as the paper sets out, it is a role play. So role play is an immersive experience. Participants in the game go through a process of decision making, and they also have a chance to evaluate their decision making process. So in other words, what we are trying to say is games can encourage learning by doing. Okay, that learning by doing is critical because it influences your thought process. That's where we are taking the argument to. Now, the another proposition that the author says games also encourage social learning. Now, to understand social learning, we will understand social learning as a double loop learning process. In the first level, it is basically scrutinizing individual choices. Individual has an opportunity to reflect through the choices they make and the impact of the resource system. And at the second level, they are given an opportunity to discuss their with participants in the game. So that creates a situation where you will discuss your experience with others, and that discussion space itself is a nice breeding ground for solutions to emerge. Okay, so social learning, so games can encourage social learning, and social learning is crucial to collective action. Okay, so again, the proposition is that through social learning, it is possible to lift the problem of groundwater management more to a collective action problem. It is currently perceived as a private issue. Groundwater is almost perceived as a private resource, and it's a private issue. But through games, we can alter preferences and thereby lift the problem from a private space to more of a collective action problem, and finally achieve the target of locating the solution in the collective action space. Okay. Games can also develop just solutions. Now, what is very typical about groundwater systems is that the productivity levels of wells, even in a small hydrogeological unit, is very varied. So in the same village, you might have certain very highly productive wells, but also to match it up, you might have some very poorly productive wells. And typically the distribution is such that it is the landed farmers who have access to highly productive wells, and the small farmers or the marginal farmers might not have access to these kind of wells. So this leads into the question that there is a need for generating a space where we can discuss the need for sharing of the resource, sharing of groundwater. But that is completely dependent on the dynamics in that village, dynamics in that community. So for any just solutions to occur, it has to come from the community, because community is sensitive to its dynamics. Okay, so games are able to achieve it. Now, another reason why it can also games can also lead to just solution is because we typically see this phenomenon. So the available option other than game is to have the external agency. This is the experience that we have had so far, is to have an external agency come into the community, and the external agency has the responsibility of orchestrating collective action. But what is peculiar and what is noticed is that, well, when the agency is operating with the community, there is that traction. People are coming back and having a common conversation. There is a common point to meet. But once the external agency exits the project, as the project comes to an end, all these institutions tend to collapse. Okay. And again, there is a third reason why games are a good way of generating just solution. This is because but even when we have concerns of equity and things like that, if an external solution is imposed into a community, it is possible that it crowds out the moral sentiments in the community. Okay, so this top-down approaches might not do enough justice and kind of deconstruct the potential of collective action in the community. So for all these reasons, games are a good solution. Okay, now we will move on to discussing what are some of the factors that affect groundwater use. The context is the state of Andhra Pradesh. So the east and the western. So first is the natural factors, and in that context, the southern and the eastern part of the state is much more resource, particularly water resources rich. There are these great rivers, Godavari and Krishna, that supplies to these this region of the state, while the north and the west part of the state is much more dry. Okay, the average rainfall in this region is somewhere between 620 mm to about 650 mm to about 720 mm. And in terms of the aquifer, these are hard aquifer regions. Now, what it means by hard aquifer regions, what we mean is that after the monsoons, so typically that's the time when the groundwater does recharge. So post monsoon season, the groundwater levels will recharge very quickly, but because these are hard aquifers, they also lose that water very quickly. Okay. Now, in terms of energy prices, the policy that the Andhra Pradesh government follows is that if the pump set has a power which is of the power greater than 10 horsepower, then there is a charge, there is a tariff to be paid. But if it is anything lesser than that, the electricity is free of use. And even when your pump set is 10 horsepower and above, what is typically paid is a monthly fee, and there is no regulation on the number of hours that this particular pump set could be turned on to. Okay, and the third factor that would affect the groundwater use is crop prices. The most popular crop here is paddy. Okay, we all know that paddy is a very water consumptive plant. The preference for paddy primarily arises from the traditional factors. In their customs and in their tradition, rice has been a very valuable crop to grow. It is a sign of affluence. So in some ways, it is growing rice kind of gives you a higher social status in the community. So farmers do want to grow rice. And there are also market factors because there is a minimum support price that is available for rice. So for both these reasons, paddy is a very popular crop. But in terms of groundwater, in a dry land scenario, if you start growing, if paddy has to be cultivated with so much of water gushing into it, depletion of groundwater is nearly inevitable there. Now, another factor that affects groundwater use is crop productivity, the index of crop productivity. Now, the only way in which we measure the performance of agriculture sector is to look at crop productivity. Now, this has the flip side because we are also dealing with very water consumptive plant. And if we focus only on crop productivity, it means that we are inviting the danger of more and more groundwater extraction. Now, this is also because there are no incentives to alternative system. For example, somebody might have a package of agriculture. They might be interested in investing and even adopting a package of agricultural practices, which can have efficiency parameters or which can be more fruitful in terms of the environmental outcomes that system might produce, but it might take a small cut in terms of the productivity that it can achieve. But that is not valued. There are no incentives supporting that, and therefore we have a very unidimensional way of measuring efficiency of agriculture system, which is crop productivity, and that itself is one of the reasons for groundwater extraction. Finally, the other factor is individual preferences, the typical factors that we consider: age, education, the social status. Now, very specific to the context is also the context of Andhra Pradesh is that this state has a huge tradition of tank systems. Some of them really date back to 2 BCE, 3 BCE. This is the Satavahana kingdoms then. So but these tank systems have suffered a great neglect. And as a result of that, what we see is that most of the tanks are silted up and their contribution to irrigation has almost been none. Okay, so in 2015, the government has introduced the Mission Kakatiya project, and the project aims to desilt nearly 46,000 tanks, and these tanks then can be a provision for water into the minor canal irrigation systems. Again, being a dryland system, and because there was a dependence on tank system, what we also observe is that there are no traditional customs or rules regarding how groundwater should be used. That kind of gives us a background that there is no history of any groundwater rules or norms practiced in the community. Okay. Okay, so now we move on to the design of the game, because this paper has a focus on game and its potential. Now, what I want you to notice that here the game was played in 2 rounds, one in year 2013 and the second time in 2014. And the process that they follow immediately after the game, which is the debriefing process, is quite crucial to social learning. So a debriefing is a process wherein you can imagine it as a focus group discussion in some way, but it is more than a focus group discussion. You bring back, after the rounds of play, you bring the community together, allow them a space to discuss about their experience of playing the game, their deductions, their reflections on their choices that they made during playing the game, and also allow them to discuss that with others in the community and arrive at a common consensus in terms of what can be done, what could have been a good strategy of game, what could not have, what is something that will allow the community to achieve a sustainable use of resource here. Because yeah, we need to look at the design of the game. The game here is a choice between crop choices and groundwater consumption. Okay, again, the obvious choice of crop choice, the obvious focus on crop choices, because groundwater, as we mentioned earlier, is a hidden resource. And only way to monitor groundwater use very easily is to trace the crop that has been grown. Okay, so in this game, the choice that were given is farmers either could opt a crop choice which would consume 2 units of groundwater, and in return you will have about 3 units of money. And the second option is to choose a crop choice which would take 3 units of groundwater, and in return you have 5 units of money. In terms of demonstrating or playing the game, they were played up to 10 rounds, so it's a repeated game. And in the first phase, farmers were not allowed to discuss with each other. So it was more of an individual play, and they have an opportunity to reflect on their strategies. Now, after the 10th round, the farmers were allowed to discuss with each other, and another few rounds were played. And what was observed is that in the second round, the depletion, so the end product of the game was that the more and more you use individual choice, the more and more you use 3 units of a crop choice which consumes 3 units of water but pays you higher, is that you very quickly deplete the groundwater level. But when the communication channel was opened, it could be seen that the depletion of groundwater was much slower. Okay. Again, in 2014, when the game was played, there were 2 modifications done into the game design, and this is very interesting as to why those modifications happened. So during the 2013 play, it was observed that particularly women farmers had a preference for highly water consumptive crops, and this is quite contrary to the thinking of dryland agriculture. Typically, it is horticultural produces, and horticulture produces, again, somewhat more associated with the male gender. But here it is interesting to see that the water consumptive crop that we have is rice, and women prefer to grow rice because it's directly associated with food security of the family. But the unfortunate side is that when there is a preference for a water consumptive crop, what gets challenged is the water left for domestic consumption. Okay, so in the second round of game, along with crop choices and the monetary reward, there was also an injection of unit of water for groundwater, particularly for the purpose of domestic consumption. Okay, and another modification in the game design was that the graphics that were used for the game was replaced with numbers. Now, this is again a common bias. We assume that in the agricultural community, because the years of formal schooling are low, we associate a poor numeracy with the community, which is definitely not the case. Farmers prefer to see the comparative and the trade-offs in terms of number rather than in terms of figures. So the new game design used numbers in the place of figures. Okay, so what are some of the conclusion that this particular piece of research drew? So games can encourage the thought process that values collective action. Games can highlight transaction costs involved in collective action and guide the ways to resolve that. So this is particularly the social learning part of the game. This is precisely where the briefing is designed into the game, and that's the space, that's the transaction cost and the social learning. What is the transaction cost and what is the social learning that is occurring? That's completely captured in the face of debriefing of the game. Again, games can build the capacity of local governance and lead to devise rules for groundwater use. So what they're primarily arguing is that games really are able to encourage collective action and self-organization. Now, what is the aspiration that we have in terms of games? Games currently is used as simply as a method of collecting data, but there is a good chance that you can lift it up to be a heuristic tool, where it is a tool that can actually be used to educate, not educate, but in the way of making the resource users more sensitive, having a better understanding, in a way demystifying the science around the resource system. Designing games, however, is going to be quite challenging. Again, there is a parallel that has to be drawn with the simplicity of the game, because it's only a simple game that can, identifying a simple game is a matter of precision, and that why it is necessary for it to be having a simple yet a precise design is so that the rule that is likely to emerge as a result of the game should be matching each other. So having a clearly defined, identifying a clear and a precise design for a game is quite challenging, but it is such a game that is more useful because it is a local governance system that is going to devise those rules and enforce those rules. So simple rules are easy to be enforced. Thirdly, the design of games should be such that NGOs should be able to practice it very easily. We know that NGOs are constrained not only in terms of finances, but also in terms of time. And because this is going to be a repetitive exercise, it is necessary that games could be very easily implemented within the limited resource of a civil society. Okay, we move on to the second research paper, which takes a little institutional angle to the whole problem. And the main research question here is, what is the nature of association between Agricultural Extension Agency and the farmers' irrigation demand? So this is a work that I had done under the supervision of my supervisor, Dr. Shailaja Fennell, and this was published last year. Now, the context of this research is the Micro Watershed Development Program. So Micro Watershed Development is it has been a very popular program to rejuvenate dryland agriculture, particularly in the last 20 years. And the idea behind the problem, as we mentioned earlier, is to harvest the annual seasonal rainfall, force that water or channel that water to a percolation tank, which can then recharge the groundwater levels. Farmers could access this groundwater and have a secure source of income. Now, Well, this is a very, I mean, in terms of its planning, in terms of its design, it's a very good program. But what was the interest behind the research is to understand what happens to those institutions of collective action and self-organization that was created as part of the program. Do they really sustain after 15 years of program? So the data and the study was conducted in villages where micro watershed development program was implemented in the early 2000s. Okay. Now, the main question was that has there been any communication in the post development project phase? If there has been any communication, how has it been? Has it been sustained? Has it been effective? That was the main questions chased. Again, so this is a visual image of a micro watershed. So the first image shows the soil and water conservation activities, primarily construction of terraces and afforestation activities, also check dams and bunds. The purpose of the whole exercise is to slow down the rainfall runoff and also channel the rainfall runoff such that the groundwater levels can be recharged. So the image on the second image that you see is a micro watershed nearly 6 to 10 years after the program implementation. You have more green grass cover, also trees. And the blue dots that you see are the percolation tanks. Those are the feeder points to recharge groundwater tables. And all this work, soil and water conservation works, have been implemented as a result of collective action in the community. Okay. Again, so what are the factors that will affect groundwater demand? Natural factors. This study is conducted in Maharashtra, so the situation changed a little, but particularly in terms of rainfall. So this region receives on an average 500 mm of rainfall. Now, this is a tall ask because most watershed development programs are likely to function in a rainfall region where it is above 650 and up to 750, 800. That's the range in which they are more likely to function well. This is simply indicating that the potential, water harvesting potential, has to be big enough for such programs to sustain. So this here is already a tall ask because we are in the drier regions of dry land. And again, it's a hard aquifer region, so the water recharge is very quick, but it also loses out very quickly. Now, again, when you are operating in regions with really low rainfall, you're also likely to work with communities who are traditionally not an agrarian community. So the appetite to do agriculture is also in some way different because they might be more, the chances of them being either a nomadic tribe or the chances of them being a shepherd community is high. And their engagement with agriculture is only subsistence farming. But here again, there is this concern, right? Most of the nomadic and shepherd communities are no more relevant. So it is also important to move this set of community to other forms of vocation, and agriculture being one of them. Again, in terms of individual factors, as we mentioned earlier, age, education, social status, but we are also interested in understanding individual interaction with the Agricultural Extension Office, as well as the community's interaction with the Agricultural Extension Office. And that community interaction with the Agricultural Extension is basically measured through the interactions of the Village Watershed Development Committee, which was a body set up as a part of the Micro Watershed Development Program to maintain and be in charge of self-governance of this system. So how has been that communication channel after the program has completed its terms? So the major findings are the external agency was successful in generating collective action for micro watershed development. We already saw the pictures, but what happens is once the agency exit the community after completion of the project, those institutions did not sustain. In terms of groundwater levels, what we see is that in the short term, of course, the groundwater levels increased, but this also sets in another process, isn't it? The more access to groundwater resource, farmers would change their crop preferences. Even in this community, they moved on to a cultivation of hugely water consumptive crops such as sugarcane. and then hit the lower bottom, in the sense like very quickly the development in the community kind of started to topple down. It started to deteriorate. There was the wells in the community started to run dry. So that challenged their development process again. And it is very interesting to notice that it is one section of the society, these farmers who were already high irrigation demanding farmers, because they were the most hit because of the absence of groundwater, over exploitation of groundwater. It is that set of farmers in the community who took that extra mile to go back to the Agricultural Extension Agency, go back to the implementing agency and ask for support. Okay, so the experience of micro watershed development in this particular landscape points us to the direction that water budgeting tool, which was introduced in the community after the community had traveled that entire phase of no water to intensive agriculture, and then depleting the water resources. So that's the time when the high irrigation farmers with the higher irrigation demand went back to the Agricultural Extension Agency. They negotiated, they understood, they learned about water budgeting tools, and water budgeting tools were brought into the community. Farmers were trained in using water budgeting tool, and that was then the saving point in some way, and they could move forward. Some form of recovery was possible. At the same time, they also moved into livelihood diversification, and in this case, it is milk cows. So what it really shows is that the groundwater management is an unsettling issue. You have access to water, agriculture intensification is most likely to happen. But that's the thing. It's a very unsettling issue, and to tackle the management of groundwater, it is necessary that we operate through many other tools and not just one way. So sequencing of development action as well as convergence of development actions are necessary. My last application paper, this is asking the question whether can participatory groundwater management enhance drought resilience. So this is a paper written by Ratna Reddy and Srinivasa Reddy and published in 2020. Both of them are champions in their field, and Krida belong to the department. Belong to Krida. And the main question that they had that the paper raises is, what should be the strategy to scale participatory groundwater management? Okay, so the second main question is that, has participatory groundwater management really made behavioral changes? Okay, so two main questions: is participatory groundwater management worth scaling up? And are there any evidences of behavioral changes that participated groundwater management has brought in? So the inspiration for the research is from the fact that there has been successful examples and there has been not very so successful examples. So what is then generalizable? Okay. Now, another reason for this question is that the effect of groundwater exploitation is often borne proportionately by small and marginal farmers. Okay, so for example, as we mentioned earlier, the most productive wells are most likely to be in the command of rich farmers, and as a process of agricultural intensification and overexploitation of groundwater sets in, they can afford to deepen the wells or their bore wells. But in the case of small and marginal farmers, they get left out of this process. Their wells run dry. Okay, so, and they simply get cut out of the irrigation system. So that burden that the small and marginal farmers carry, that is something very unfortunate. So these are the two reasons why they set out to look at whether this program should be scaled and whether there are any behavioral changes that this program does bring in. So the particular program they are studying is the Andhra Pradesh Farmer Managed Groundwater System. The pilot project of this program was set in the year 1995, and was funded by the Netherlands government. The pilot project basically handheld some farmers, handheld a few selected farmers in the measurement of groundwater levels and also measuring the rainfall that they receive. So the pilot project was very successful, following which the model was replicated in more than 500 villages, covering nearly 7 drought-prone districts in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Now, again, the model here is completely, demystifying the information about the resource system. And there are many activities that this project took up. A few very popular activities have been the farmer water schools. So farmer water schools, nearly 300 schools were set up, training more than 10,000 farmers in collecting data. Okay, so something that we refer to as citizen data now. Data about groundwater and recharge. So to get an idea of the magnitude of this training program and data collection process, there were more than 2,000 observation wells. So roughly one observation well in every square kilometer. And the rain gauge was installed nearly every 5 kilometers. So data was so extensively collected. This data then was used to prepare proper crop water budget. And again, we know the water budgeting principle, isn't it? We look at crop choice, we look at the water availability, the recharge and harvest, and see what crop can be cultivated with the available groundwater levels. Again, an additional work that the program took up is with regard to soil assessments, because in dryland regions, the importance of soil moisture, retaining the soil moisture during the crop season cannot be emphasized enough. So there were a lot of programs of soil management and land management, a list of agricultural practices that were advocated to keep the soil moisture level and push up the level of productivity. So some of the main findings of the program is that there was no clear evidence that water balance. So in other way to say that there was no clear evidence that groundwater better in the AP farms regions. Activities such as measuring the groundwater level ceased when the program stopped. It's something that we saw in the previous paper as well. Once the program is over, all the collective action orchestrated by an external agency just ceased to work. Water budget can be seen as still continuing, but it is done at a much informal level. I think it's primarily coming from the fact that farmers do appreciate the importance of that water budgeting technique, but the transaction costs involved in getting the whole community to plan it and to agree it and to abide by it is so high that it's continuing only at an informal level. In terms of behavioral change, that was one of the primary research question. Again, what we see is that area undercropping, multi-cropping. Okay, so we have to remember the preferred cropping in these regions are also paddy. But the behavioral change that we see is that area under multi-cropping had increased. And because of the water stress in these regions, the market for non-paddy crops also developed. Okay, so that's kind of aiding the behavioral change process. There has been a shift to multi-cropping methods, multi-cropping preferences, and then there is also development of a market for non-paddy crops. So to summarize it, the water balance situation did not improve. So that is the first question we started with, isn't it? How do we improve the groundwater conditions in these regions? So what the research project clearly indicates is that the water balance situation did not improve. However, farmers have improved the resilience to climate risks by adopting crop diversification. So I'll finish with the last slide, which is about scaling up lessons. So management of common pool resource institution needs to be nurtured for a long time. So this is a very interesting case because you need to allow the community to go through a process of learning, and these learning processes could be 10 years, could be 15 years, could be more. So a complete learning cycle, that is a good run with recharge groundwater level, and then go through a phase of over exploiting that resource, and then falling into the path of recovery again. So that's time. And this becomes very important because most of these projects are funded by external agencies. So that's where it becomes critical. What is the cost of development that we are ready to bear? Now, building community awareness are likely to work in the short term. So all your citizen sciences and water management and collective actions, so self-organization, all that can deliver better groundwater health, but this is only sustainable to the short run. If we need long-term transition and if we need really a sustainable system, it is necessary that incentives are properly incorporated into the system. Primarily markets for non-water consumptive foods need to develop. Now, if you look at it in paddy and sugarcane, these are very popular crops. There are MSPs. Farmers have a clear preference for growing them, while there are very little incentives for farmers who take up alternative systems of cropping. So yes, so incentives and the markets need to develop if we are looking at groundwater. The solution just does not come from the collective action and self-organization space. Now, the hardest one to tackle is the equity concern, given that groundwater is inequitably distributed. And the only hope of correcting that is to put in proper places, is to put in the approach of water sharing. Now, if you look at all the groundwater development, we also started this introduced this in the introduction, that the development of watershed, development in groundwater has been completely a private investment. What we have opened up is a system of atomistic development of groundwater. That cannot be the future. There has to be more thought. Of course, this requires very high transaction costs. Certainly that is the case, but there is a need to develop water sharing approaches. And it is very necessary to have the regulatory backing, again, a tall ask, but the delinking of land use rights from water resources is necessary for sustainable groundwater management. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rekha. Yeah, it's an important presentation because I think we have not touched upon water resource at all since morning, and I don't think there is any other presentation on water resource as much as I can think of. So it's important in that sense, and also collective action is a problem that cuts across many solutions that are proposed in agriculture. Be it marketing, be it so like FPOs, SGs and all. So there is dire need to understand collection failures, collective action successes. So it's important, and the measures some of the things that you've mentioned are critical to understanding these aspects. So for now, we can have few questions and or comments or clarifications, contrarian views, whatever we could say. So now I think Gayatri has a question. Maybe, yeah, Gayatri.
Yeah. Good evening, ma'am. So
Hi, Gayatri.
my name is hello. My name is Yeah. Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor. I'm also doing my PhD in input subsidies and how it contributes to agriculture in its pros and cons. So I have a question for you. I mean, actually, I need your opinion, not a question. So when I was going through these subsidies, input subsidies, the main argument was there were a lot of debates. So one of the main debate was I'm sorry, that's my baby. So one of the main debate was that the input subsidies, one of the main input subsidies is irrigation subsidy. So those subsidies are one of the main reason for groundwater depletion in India. So what is your
Sorry, I'm not able to hear you.
My baby?
Not able to.
Can
Sorry,
you hear
I heard till ground subsidy for irrigation. Could you follow after that, please?
Yeah, sure. So one of the I need your opinion on it. Should we actually stop this irrigation subsidy because there's a lot of I'm really sorry.
No problem. I think I got the bit and piece of your
Yeah,
question.
so one thing is, should we actually stop these subsidies? Because there are some debates that it's really costly for the government, and the second thing, it actually leads to a groundwater depletion to a great extent. So, what is
Yeah,
your
yeah.
opinion on this?
So now looking at the literature in groundwater development, we have to remember that groundwater development in a way has come because of the failure of the canal irrigation system, isn't it? So if you think about how they can, like, I'm talking about 200 years ago, the way in which the canal irrigation system was designed, that was an era when there are large landholding farmers, and there could be proper estimates made in terms of what would be the water that has to be supplied through the channel, what would be the demand for those surface water will be. And that was in a way supplied, and farmers were asked to pay a tax as well. So when in the colonial period, there was a tax paid, water tax paid by these large landholding farmers. So to the extent that the operation and maintenance cost of irrigation canals were taken care of. But I think with the economic state that we were post-independence, there was this push of looking at irrigation not as an economic good, but more as a service in the society, more as a crucial resource, need to be supplied at really no price, so that so that the agriculture sector could be the engine of economic growth. But now we are so much years from then. Now to reverse that has been a real big challenge. And if we look at the development of groundwater, the green revolution again has to play a very important role in it. It's right. The wells and the bore wells, I mean, what we could achieve. I'm not criticizing green revolution, because what it achieved when it was asked to achieve was really, really something that is great. I mean, that was a huge challenge overcome, but then it did set up the situation where there is more and more dependence on groundwater. And I was even surprised to see that canal irrigations are now designed with the idea of supplying to just recharge your well. So yeah. So whether how prices operate, like even not only in terms of the prices that you will give for the water, but also in terms of electricity. When you say, like, there is also this argument, right? Should electricity tariffs be zero? Should we allow that? It's a very tough question. If you take an efficiency point of view, economic efficiency argument, yes, these resources need to be charged. These resources need to be, these are not free resources. It should be treated as an economic good. But I'm still not in a position to make up my mind whether we should really treat it like an economic good. What is the cost involved in treating these resources as an economic good is also something that is not very clearly answered. So I would only hedge it with saying that if efficiency argument is the center of your analysis, then tariff will make sense. But if it is some other aspect, equity, some other aspect that you're working with, then probably we will have to rework that equation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rekha. I think good thing is you raised some of the contextualized it within the historical developments. I think tomorrow Dr. Richa Kumar is talking a bit on that. I think she's questioning this narrative of whether the Green Revolution was needed at that time, and those kind of things. And I think she's also probably, at least her work seems to question the way we have read the history. But I think so. Again, this efficiency also, as you mentioned, I think she is going to question whether, even from efficiency point of view, do we need that? Huh? So I would urge you, if you can come. Well, it's at 7 o'clock, so then there is reason to say 5, 6 or something. So if at all you have time, I would also want you to attend. If you are available. Yeah. Now Ansi has a question. Yeah, Ansi. Yeah.
Hello, Ansi.
Hi, sir. Sir, I don't have the question, but I just want to say thank you to ma'am for taking this nice section. And I really want to appreciate you, ma'am, the way you explained very peace and calmful manner so that I can understand very well. In between, I
Thank
felt
you very
like
much.
I am sitting in Tirtha ma'am's class as well because she used to explain things like this by explaining a lot of papers, findings like that. So thank you, ma'am, for coming and
Thank you very
taking this
much.
section.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. There is something on the chat.
Yeah, Rohit has a question. What are the
Okay,
methods
what are
to-
the methods to investigate spring water? Wow. Okay. So I'm assuming are these, I mean, spring water should be seasonal, and I'm assuming it is groundwater. I mean, the subterranean should be the source. Am I right? Rohit?
Yeah, Rohit.
Yeah, I'm assuming. Yeah, I'm assuming that. So, again, here again, the nature of the resource. Now, if I'm using the socio-ecological systems framework, that nature of the resource is very important, isn't it? How quickly, how often do they emerge, and what is the primary purpose of this resource? Whether, I mean, all that dots. So if you're asking me how to investigate, I would definitely encourage you to look at the SES framework of Ostrom. I think that's a good starting point.
Anybody has any questions on the methods, the games that were played, modalities of the game? So I think as you think of some research questions, the experimental methods is one interesting way to approach the problem, and there were some aspects Dr. Rekha covered. So any of you has any questions on that?
I think I will fill in it up with a little more information because I kind of rushed through the design of the program as well. So what I wanted to highlight is definitely collective action issues have been studied using games. That is definitely one aspect of it, but you will have to be really careful about translation of those findings into real life settings. And that's where I think the challenges emerge.
So, like your paper also involved a game design, or was it survey?
Yeah, because it was more looking at the extended communication between the institutions and agriculture. So I had used a logit model to understand what is the participation, what is the kind of influence on crop choices, that kind of. No, I did not use a game.
Yeah. If anybody has questions, you can type it in the chat window or raise your hand. I could ask you to state the question. Motivation depletion.
Yes, and end of the day, it's really 7 o'clock, isn't it?
7 hours to exponential decline. Okay. Yeah, Gayatri has a question. Oh, she needs your email ID. Yeah, that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's possible. So. So that is RAB229 at cam.ac.uk.
So Gayatri, is there some question which you don't want us to know or no answers of? So you could also ask the question. Otherwise, you could ask the question here. There is time, so yeah.
No, sir, there's nothing like that. But in future, since my topic
Okay.
actually
Oh, you
relates
asked
to
the
this.
question. Sorry, no, I thought you already asked the question, right? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, anybody is having anything like their research or something, and if they want to.
Yeah, I can see a hand from Himanshu.
Yeah, Himanshu, yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so in one of your findings, you have shown that the groundwater levels improved in short term, but later term it deteriorated. So is there any method which will make sustainable for the longer term?
So now if you ask me the question of method, like, are you referring to measurement of groundwater? So let me put it in this way. Because we are working with common pool resource, it's clearly a biophysical indicator. Okay, so so any resource that you take, for example, if you're working with fisheries, then you're talking about the replenishment rate of fish. Yeah, so the rate at which the fish would grow, the catch. What I mean is the entire catch, and how much can you harvest out of that catch. If you're talking about water again, groundwater again, how much of the water is replenished, how much of a recharge is happening, and how much have you extracted. So what I'm trying to emphasize is that when we are in the discussions of common pool resources, we certainly have a physical indicator, like a resource indicator, okay, which tells us the direction of whether it is an upward movement, is the resource being overexploited or the resources being underexploited. Now, when I said the resource was depleting in the short term, it is primarily stemming from the extractive activities of human beings, isn't it? So it's like this, a community which never had wells, after the watershed development, the number of wells just proliferate. Okay, so agricultural intensification just sets in because you have access to irrigation now. So that depletion is basically coming from the need for communities to get into that agricultural intensification process, because that's their livelihood. We are shifting them from one form of livelihood to something else. So that is one reason why it decreases in the short term. And the question of how do we ensure that these resources don't decline in the long term or in the medium term? And that's where the question is, isn't it? In terms of measurement, we are still looking at the groundwater recharge level. That will be one of your primary indicator. But what happens with the process of agricultural intensification? I think that's where the research will focus, to understand why some things last in the short term and why some things don't last for the long term. So that user interaction space, okay, what happens with the agricultural intensification, what factors lead to agricultural intensification, that's the discussion which will determine the long term, the medium term, long term effect, including market support. So the incentives, I think the incentives and the regulatory framework, that will be the indicators to be monitoring if you're looking at the medium term or the long term impacts.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah, just to add to that question, or maybe an element of that question, how do we measure this? Because it again comes largely from my ignorance of not working much in groundwater. So how do we measure this groundwater recharge in a setting, like in a study? So when we say groundwater have depleted, what is the metric we use and how do we go about measuring it? Because again, some of them might want to research in these areas. So how it happens on the ground, if there are few inputs there, it might be useful for them. Yeah.
Yeah. So to monitor groundwater, we are like looking at the observation wells. So we trace the observation wells, and now there is more and more apps that are available, groundwater monitoring apps available to monitor groundwater. There is a lot of training around that activity as well, because again, I'm touching upon the concept of, the only way that we are able to encourage collective action is by demystifying the knowledge around groundwater. And by training people with all these little aspects of, how quickly your well recharges, having these registers to literally, when you go to the villages, certain, particularly the sarpanch, they might have a register where they record the rainfall and the groundwater level in the observation wells in a region. So observation wells, yes, some form of apps again, but that is also dependent on the observation wells. Yeah. Connected to the observation wells. Yes, Binod, I can see. I'm happy to take your question.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes. Hi.
Am I audible?
Yes, very clearly.
In in a game theory framework, whenever you are going for any experimental analysis of any particular topics, you have to make some hypothetical situation, like you have to create some hypothetical situations and play some particular games, okay, and you draw the some behavioral aspect or behavioral things, or how they are behaving in a particular situations, and you can draw that situation with the practical, like you draw the reference from that particular hypothetical situations. But my question is that how that particular hypothetical situation, a particular, like, persons are heterogeneous in their behavior also, but how that, like, how hypothetical situations is consistent with the reality when you come to the real situation?
That's a very good question. That's indeed a very good question. Okay, that gives me the opportunity to talk a little more about games as it is used in groundwater management, and it is used to measure collective action in some ways. So even in the example that we quoted today, this game has been developed by an international organization. So ICSSR, right? ICSSR is the organization that has developed this game. And unlike the game theory, which has, as you said, a hypothetical situation, it's much more deterministic in its approach, right? But games, as is used in today's discussion, games as is referred in today's discussion, it is replication of the real life situation itself. There is no hypothesis that we are creating there. So the challenge is to defining a game, and this is typically done with a lot of research. It's not a person's or a department's job. It's really really something that takes years to develop. Agencies specialize in developing these games because these are real life situations. They are not hypothesis. They are not a hypothetical situation. We don't cover that bridge. We don't walk that bridge where a hypothetical situation is modeled and we try to extrapolate that into real life situation. That's just not the way in which games have been referred today. Here, games mimic the real life situation. And therefore, developing such games is really challenging. But it's very interesting to see that not only in terms of groundwater management, but this development of real life scenario and stimulating the real life scenario is a popular method of learning. Like, it's a very important tool to teach something. It's a very important tool to build. So pardon my use of the word teach. When I say teach, it's just meaning that it just is a reference to encouraging people to think again, rather than telling that, you are learning something, you do not know anything. No, that's not the position that we are taking. That's not our positionality. Our positionality is more in terms of you are aware of it. We are making it more evident to you. So it's really the real life scenario that has been modeled in the game. Does that answer your question?
Thank you for the response, but I have another interest, another question come to my mind while you are speaking these things. Like in case of behavioral economics, there is framing effect. Okay, and if you frame a particular situations like in positive way and negative way, then the response is completely different. Okay, like that if you are giving a particular situation to the particular individuals, and the similar type of situation they face in the real life, then there may be the difference. Like there is, if you place
talking about the measurement issues. Are you talking about the measurement issues? So if I get your question right, if you're saying if we position the game in a positive direction and measuring an outcome, and in the same way using punishment or showing that the resource will deteriorate, using that language and playing the game and what results it will produce, is that what you are telling me?
No, I'm not asking about that. I'm asking that, like in case of behavioral economics, two different, like there is a framing effect like that. Okay, can you see that scenario? That maybe there is a deviation, like the same situation is positioned in positive way and negative way. Okay, in case of framing model, framing effect. But here I am saying that in the similar type, like it's not about the positive and negative way, but here one is giving a particular situations that may not be practical, but another is practical if you go to the field, like if a person practical life, and I'm just saying about that. So one practical, another is like imaginary, like but situation is similar.
Yeah. Sir, can I just add before you? Maybe I think what we know maybe referring is, say we said in the example that you had shown, it was about 2 units of water and you get 3 units, 3 rupees, something like that. Say instead, if we had something like actual return, the average actual returns, would the in that sense we are framing it differently, where it's much more realistic. Would that have a difference in the what we find? Yeah.
So when
Sorry.
so as I mentioned it earlier, the design of the game is also a protected material in the sense like how that game was designed, what all ethical concerns, as well as what all checklists that it has gone through, what all the process of scrutiny that, because see, we have to imagine more than 500 communities are playing this game when it was designed. So I'm sure it goes through a lot of checks, and how much of that information is also applicable to public domain. And even when you're writing your own research paper, I think they will only disseminate the information and of course explain the design, but the rigor that is used in terms of ensuring that the game does not disorient in any way. So that ethical responsibility is something that these institutions will take, and we will not have information on that.
Thank you. Thank you for this.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, Rekha, that's a very, very good session. I think Q&A also. I think some of the students are planning to do some experiments, so they probably had more interest on how those design aspects were getting done, and they can email you at a later stage if they have any specific doubts in their experimental design or in their research design. And thanks a lot for agreeing to this talk. I don't think we gave too long a notice. You're back to CDS virtually after 7 years or 8 years.
Yes. I think I had briefly been there in the year 2014.
14, so 8 years, yeah. So 8 years. Yeah. So maybe 9th year you're here offline. We'll see next year also. We plan to do this series, and hope to look forward to seeing you here. Thank you, Rekha, and
thank you very much.
Thank you, participants who have 28 of them have survived from morning 9 to 7. We started with 47, I think. So then tomorrow morning again 9:30. They all have to be here. So
right.
Thank you, Rekha, and the participants tomorrow
thank you very
morning
much.
9:30. Yeah. Okay, tomorrow
thank
morning 9:30.
Thank you.
All of you. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your patience. Really,